Welcome to our next Wandering Walks of Wonder adventure. Today we're headed down to Missouri to Joplin. Joplin is a very historic city with a great history of Route 66, as we see here starting off our walk at the Route 66 Mural Park. But it has a history that dates back to about 1838 when a judge by the name of James Cox first settled in this portion of Jasper County, Missouri. Judge Cox soon built a small cabin on what is now the eastern limits of Joplin. As he owned much of the land and had the biggest cabin around, he had the first post office in the area. But more importantly, Judge Cox was the first to discover lead in the area. One summer day, one of his slaves found a strange blue rock beside a small creek. That slave took the rock to Cox, and Cox quickly recognized that this was lead and quickly filed a claim for the land all along the banks of that small creek. It didn't take long for word to spread that there was potentially large quantities of lead in the area, and soon settlers made their way to this portion of the state, claiming land and working to set up small mining operations. About a year after Judge Cox arrived in Jasper County, Reverend Harris G. Joplin came to town. Reverend Joplin was a Methodist Episcopal preacher who settled in the area to establish one of the first churches in southwest Missouri. In 1873, when the town was officially founded, a name was required. As Reverend Joplin was one of the most prominent citizens in this part of Missouri, city leaders chose to name the town Joplin. Due to the extensive mining operations in Jasper County and just outside the Joplin city limits, railroad transportation of the minerals became extremely important. This building that we're walking past on our right is one of the first railroad operations here in Joplin. It was a railroad called the St. Louis and San Francisco Railway. This building was constructed to support the offices of that railway. To commemorate the importance of mining in the area, the last railroad spike to be pounded into the ground was made of lead. By 1890, the population of Joplin was around 10,000 people, and just 10 years later it had grown to well over 25,000 people. With so many people moving into town and the extensive mining operations in the surrounding area, manufacturing became another large industry that helped Joplin to grow. Drill tools, boilers, and mining equipment were all manufactured in Joplin for use throughout the region. Across the street from us here is this beautiful building that was once the Newman Brothers building but is now Joplin City Hall. In 1898, Albert Newman opened his first store here in Joplin. His store sold many things such as clothing, boots, and shoes. The primary customers were the miners who flooded into the area to work in the zinc and lead mines that were opening up, and the store was very successful. By the early 1900s, shoppers had become more sophisticated and the number of goods for sale had increased dramatically. The need for larger, high-rise department-style stores started coming into fashion, and in 1910, the Newman Brothers commissioned noted architect Austin Allen to construct this large store for their growing business. This was a building with a lot of windows over a steel and concrete frame that allowed more light into the building. In 2003, the building was completely renovated, and it is now stands as the beautiful Joplin City Hall. And here inside the lobby are some historic artifacts, as well as a good look at what the store once looked like. During the early 1900s, the economy of Joplin began to decline. Lead mining was halted during World War I, and many of the miners had left town to fight in the war, and the railroad transportation system was nearly halted because of the war effort. Lead and zinc were not considered required minerals during that war. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, Joplin's economy was hit extremely hard. Many businesses went bankrupt, and people left the area to search for work. One notorious couple did arrive in Joplin during this time. In 1933, Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker robbed several businesses in the city. Between robberies, they hid out in a small home within the city limits. One of their neighbors tipped off the police, and a raid of their building was quickly enacted by law enforcement. Bonnie and Clyde escaped, but not before killing 2 police officers. Inside the home, the police found a camera, and the local paper developed the film, and several of the more iconic photos of Bonnie and Clyde were a result of this camera. Following World War II, most of the mines in the area closed, and the population began to stabilize, and manufacturing became the leading industry in the city. Route 66 ran through much of this city, and we'll talk about that here a little bit later in the walk. As well as that, Route 66 provided numerous impacts on the economy with hotels, restaurants, and more that lined the road. Joplin is also most noted for an event that happened on May 22, 2001, where the lives of those who lived in Joplin changed forever. Around 5:30 p.m., a massive EF5 tornado touched down on the western edge of the city and traveled through much of the major population and retail sections of Joplin, destroying over 2,400 homes. 161 people lost their lives that evening. While it has taken many years for the city to recover, Joplin has bounced back stronger than before. As we walk through the downtown area, there's many historic buildings like the Chrisman building that we see here. Chrisman's Dry Goods Company was founded in 1890 by Peter Chrisman and Edward Blydung. Chrisman's, like Newman's Brothers store that we saw earlier, originally sold clothes and shoes. But in 1917, as business continued to grow, Chrisman built this large department store building. In 1954, R.H. Macy and Company purchased Chrisman's. While the Chrisman family still owned the building, the store's name changed to Macy's. But in 1976, Macy's left Joplin, and the building was leased to 2 former Macy employees who opened it as Chrisman's department store once again. Unfortunately, they went out of business a few years later, and now the building has been turned into loft space. Across the street from us, in a building that is now a local church, is what was once the Fox Theater. It was one of the most ornate and uniquely designed buildings in downtown Joplin. The Fox Theater was built in 1930 and is designed in a unique Spanish Revival style. That style carries forward into the interior of the building, where much of the original design and plaster work still stands. Shortly after the turn of the 20th century, movie houses sprang up all over the U.S., and Joplin had one of the first movie theaters in this area. By the 1920s, the number one form of entertainment in the United States was a night out at the movies. One of the best-known movie theater architects, L.P. Larson, visited Joplin in 1927 and came to the conclusion that the town needed an opulent movie house. This building was constructed and opened in 1930, and on opening night it featured a live show called Wild and Woolly that had dancing cowgirls and singing cowboys. Across the street from us is the old U.S. Post Office and Courthouse that was built in 1936. It's designed in the Renaissance Revival style of architecture, and it once housed a federal courthouse, the Joplin Post Office, as well as offices for the U.S. Marshals. In 1962, the post office moved from this building to a larger facility, and in the 1990s, most of the other federal agencies moved from the building. Today, it houses private office space. Across the street from us is the Costco building, which now houses the Spiva Art Center. In 1913, Miss Henrietta Cosgrove financed the construction of this building. It was extremely rare during the early 1900s for a female to build such a large and expensive building, but Miss Cosgrove was no ordinary female in her time. She was a community leader who was active in many political and civic affairs in the city. Miss Cosgrove worked side by side with her husband when they opened a zinc mine just outside Joplin. And when her husband passed away, Miss Cosgrove continued to run the mining operation. Built in 1918, this six-story building was designed by prominent local architect August Michaelis. The building was originally called the Gentry Apartments when it opened, but in 1935 the name of the building was changed to the Zahn Apartments. In the late 1800s, Joplin experienced an economic boom brought about by the opening of the mines. This economic boom dramatically increased the population of the city, and the Zahn Apartments complex met the needs of the upper-class residents who didn't want to purchase a home right away. While the upper 5 floors featured 6 apartments on each floor, the ground floor was used at one time as retail space. The first storefront in the building was leased to the B.F. Goodrich Rubber Company so they could sell automobile tires. Handy Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME Church, is a historic African American church that was built in 1903. The AME Church was created in 1816, and the first AME churches in the U.S. were organized by people of African descent whose ancestors were enslaved Africans taken to America. The church was formed as a response to being officially discriminated against by white congregants in the Methodist Church. Across the street from the church is the Elks Club building. This building was constructed in 1904 to house the local chapter of the Elks Club. Ahead of us is First Christian Church. In 1867, Israel Patton moved from Indiana to southwest Missouri. As a former believer of the Christian Church, Patton soon began holding services beneath a small grove of trees on the outskirts of Joplin. Soon, the small congregation began meeting in a log schoolhouse, and within a few short years, congregants had built a small log meeting house called the Short Creek Christian Church. As the congregation grew, church services were moved closer to town. In 1901, they constructed this beautiful building for First Christian Church, and it has continued to become their permanent home. In the early 1830s, a Methodist minister made his way into the southwest area of Missouri and started a small congregation. These hardy folks were living on what was the western frontier of the United States at that time. The name of the traveling minister was Reverend Harris G. Joplin. Yes, the town of Joplin is named for that minister. That means that the First United Methodist Church and Joplin have been linked together for over 190 years. As Joplin continued to grow, the congregation grew in size as well. The church building was completed in 1905 and remains the spiritual home for the congregants of First United Methodist. A Masonic Lodge has been in Joplin since the city was first established. Joplin's first Masonic Lodge was in rented space on Main Street. They shared the meeting hall with the Oddfellows fraternity. In the early 1900s, Joplin's Masonic Lodge membership had continued to grow from a few hundred men to several thousand. The lodge decided they needed more space, and Charles Schifferdecker, a leading mine owner and civic leader, purchased property here at 5th and Byers as the future site of the Scottish Rite Temple. In 1923, this large Bow-style arts Scottish Rite Cathedral opened. Since then, the building has continued to be used by the local Masons organization. We're now heading into a historic residential area called Murphysburg. As we walk outside of the downtown area into this residential area, you kind of feel like you've stepped back in time a century. Just a few blocks west of downtown is the Murphysburg district. Murphysburg is a 42-acre tract of land that was purchased in 1871 by Patrick Murphy. Originally, Murphy's plans were to create a town called Murphysburg, but just a few years after purchasing the land, the city of Joplin incorporated the area as one of its subdivisions. Beginning in the late 1800s, Murphysburg became a booming residential area. This is where the leading businessmen and civic leaders of Joplin built their homes. And as you can tell as we walk through the area, most of these homes are large and beautiful and continue to stay that way today. As many of these men owned the lucrative zinc and lead mines just outside Joplin, they built some of the most extravagant homes in the entire city. Murphysburg still retains the feel of that wealthy neighborhood that the upper-class residents built in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Many of the 200-plus homes in this area have been lovingly restored and maintained for over 100 years. One of these historic homes is the Bassam House. Like many of the wealthy families that built homes in the Murphysburg neighborhood, Charles Fry was a major investor in several mining companies around Joplin. He built this second Empire-style home in 1891. When the house was first built, it had a square tower on the third floor, and the roof of that tower was shaped like a pyramid. But over the years, that tower fell into disrepair and had to be removed. Inside the home, there's a rare circular staircase that leads residents to the upper floors. Charles Fry sold the house to Fred Bassam in 1898. Bassam made his money in the telephone industry. He helped organize Joplin's first telephone company and Bassam himself made history when he became the first person in Joplin to receive a speeding ticket. Joplin had just passed a law requiring police officers to arrest anyone who was driving faster than 6 miles per hour. Bassam was hauled into court and had to pay a fine. It was estimating he was driving well in excess of 10 miles per hour. Although there are many beautiful and historic homes in the Murphysburg neighborhood, the one that really stands out is that of the house of Charles Schifferdecker, built in 1890. This home is constructed in the Romanesque style and is meant to look like a castle. That's not surprising, as Mr. Schifferdecker was an immigrant from the Rhine Valley in Germany. In fact, Schifferdecker brought many workers from Germany to help construct this house. Charles immigrated to the U.S. when he was only 18 years old and quickly moved to Joplin and opened the first brewery in town with his partner, Edward Zelliken. Schifferdecker honored the first business he created by having his German craftsmen carve hop vines across the friezes above the windows of the house. Schifferdecker gave up the brewery business when zinc and lead were found in the area, and he quickly became one of the wealthiest men in town due to the success of his mining businesses. In later years, Schifferdecker was a generous philanthropist and donated many parks and buildings to the residents of Joplin. In 1874, Reverend Robert Wall, a traveling priest, gave the first Episcopal service in Joplin. St. Phillips was organized as a parish in 1891. This beautiful Gothic-inspired church was officially dedicated in 1911. St. Peter's Catholic Parish was established in 1876 by Father Henry H. O'Reilly. The parish was rather small in its beginning. There were only about 15 families during the early years. In 1885, several nuns moved from Kentucky to Joplin and created the Sisters of Our Lady of Mercy Convent. They soon opened a school to teach local children. Father O'Reilly and the Sisters of Our Lady of Mercy had a big impact on the community. It was through their efforts that the first hospital in Joplin was founded. In 1906, this Gothic revival-style church was built by the parish. It's constructed in locally mined Carthage limestone. In the early 1900s, Joplin civic leaders pressured the Board of Education to build a new high school. The one high school that was in town at the time, that was built in 1897, was overcrowded, had poor lighting, and was literally just falling apart. In 1915, the board approved borrowing $350,000 to build this new high school. In 1917, during the laying of the cornerstone, a time capsule full of papers and artifacts was placed in the cornerstone. The school opened 1 year later in 1918, but one thing the school didn't have that year was a German language class. Due to the just ended World War I, speaking German was not something a lot of citizens did at the time. The school had another first as well. As the school was short on qualified teachers, the school district hired their first married woman to teach one of its courses. This was something never done before in a Joplin school. Following World War I, citizens in Joplin were searching for a way to memorialize the men and women who served in the armed services. The local American Legion post began seeking donations for funding of a new auditorium that would honor those who lost their lives in the war. In 1924, on what was called National Defense Day, hundreds of residents from the community gathered here at the corner of West 8th Street and South Joplin Avenue to celebrate the laying of the cornerstone of Joplin Memorial Hall. About a year later, in October of 1925, Joplin Memorial Hall opened to the public. Its 2,800-seat auditorium became the perfect location for numerous entertainment events, including concerts, circuses, musical performances, and Broadway shows. I hope you've enjoyed this Wandering Walks of Wonder tour here in downtown Joplin. If you're a resident of Joplin, leave a comment on what your experiences are like in the city, or if you've visited Joplin before, leave a comment as well. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and we will see you on our next Wandering Walks of Wonder adventure. Take care now. Bye-bye.